Kia ora, and
Kia
welcome
ora.
along to this walk tour celebrating Carmen Rupe. My name's Gareth,
And I'm Roger.
and together we're...
Roger and Gareth?
And
Or
it's
Gareth and Roger?
That's fantastic, and it's great to have you along on this virtual walk tour today. This is part of Wellington Pride, so we hope you're having a wonderful Pride Festival, and thank you to the Pride Festival for including us in the rundown. Today is also very special as well because just yesterday or the day before, the Queen passed away, and so I would like to pay tribute to the Queen. We were walking in town yesterday and saw the flag flying at half-mast. I think today with the King Charles being appointed, it's gone back up to full-mast, but then it will come back down for half-mast for about 10 days, I think. So she did a lot of service over 70 years and quite an extraordinary life. So a tribute to her as well. This walk tour is all about the wonderful Carmen Rupe, who was in Wellington for 2 times. The first in the 1950s, and then more in the 1960s, so from about 1967 through to 1980. And that's the kind of period we're going to be focusing on. Her life was so rich. We won't be covering all of it, just a very kind of select period in that time. A lot of the information from this tour comes from her wonderful autobiography, and this was released in 1988, and it's well worth a read, and you can still get it in libraries and also online. Should just also point out that the background behind us is showing the boat shed, and the boat shed was where Carmen had her 70th birthday, and it was an amazing event, so we've been told. So it's nice to start off by looking at the boat shed. Just to give you an idea, the boat shed is just on Wellington waterfront, and we would normally be starting this tour, if we were doing it physically, would be starting the tour in Civic Square. So just to give you a bit of an idea of the time that Carmen lived in the 60s and 70s in Wellington, this was a time that was a lot more socially conservative. So things like homosexual law reform, it was still illegal to have homosexual activity, so homosexual law reform happened in the mid-80s. Sex work was illegal, that didn't get legalised until about 2003, 2004. Things like strip shows, so adult entertainment. At the time in the 70s, it was indecent to have a full strip, so you had to wear pasties on your nipples and a G-string. In terms of liquor, the liquor licensing laws were quite restrictive back in the 70s. Bars closed, up until 1967, bars closed at 6 p.m, and so that's where you got the 6 o'clock swill, where people would drink up, and then they would often go to other places like coffee houses to keep kind of socialising. From 1967, it turned into a 10 o'clock closing for some years, and so it was very hard to get liquor licenses for a lot of other places. And this is where you got those special coffees that would happen at Carmen's and Chrissy Wituku's Evergreen, where they would put alcohol in first and then coffee in secondary. So these are just some of the things that Carmen was dealing with in the 60s and 70s in Wellington.
So the question really is, why is Carmen important? And there are lots of really good reasons for why she's important. She was an entertainer. She was a highly successful businesswoman. I think in the 15 years that she was living in Wellington, she had at least 12 separate businesses, so very entrepreneurial. But above all, Carmen was a leader, a trailblazer in so many ways, and we'll talk about some of those ways in which she was a real trailblazer and years ahead of her time throughout the tour that's coming up. Carmen is already immortalised in Wellington with the pedestrian traffic lights along Cuba Street. That was sort of her area, and the green walk signs are all images of Carmen. She advocated for sex work, for abortion law reform, and homosexual law reform in the 1970s, so decades in many cases before those things actually came to pass in New Zealand. She created safe spaces for the community and good employment opportunities for Rainbow community members and others in Wellington. She was political. She ran for mayor in Wellington in the 1970s, and we'll talk about that a wee bit soon. She became a lifelong promoter of safer sex practices when HIV emerged in New Zealand in the 1980s, and she offered the best toasted sandwiches in town. She welcomed everyone. But for a brief overview of Carmen's life, firstly, she self-identified as transsexual and trisexual. She said that she'd try anything. She was born on the 10th of October 1936 in Waimiha, just north of Taumarunui, and she spent the early years of her life on the family farm with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. She daydreamed of becoming a Hollywood movie starlet, but she also had real ambitions of working to become a nurse. Her first public performance was at the age of 15 in the Anzac Day concert in Taumarunui, where she did a hula dance. And there's a great image here of Carmen just a year later when she was 16 performing in Dunedin. In her teens she moved to Auckland and found a gay and drag scene there, and she began doing sex work in her early 20s. She'd travel with some of her clients on the ships between Auckland and Sydney, and she eventually moved to Sydney in 1959, and she worked there in the hospitality and performance and sex work industries. She returned to New Zealand in the early 1960s and briefly lived in Wellington, where she was convicted for brothel keeping. Now, she spent 6 months in Mount Crawford Prison on the Miramar Peninsula before moving to Sydney and then before moving to Auckland and then back to Sydney. In Sydney, she was known as Kiwi Carmen, and there's this great image here of her in the 1960s looking fabulous. She returned to Wellington in 1967 and lived here until 1980, and this really is where our tour begins, those Wellington years in the 1970s. So, to our first stop.
And our first stop is actually just a little bit off from the boat shed where we had the 70th birthday, and it's the balcony of 57A Victoria Street. And the balcony is now the Wellington Public Library, or currently it's empty, but you can see behind us this is the corner at which the balcony existed, and it's the building there now. And so this is what it looked like in Carmen's time. So this is in the 1970s, and the balcony was situated on the first floor. You can see the signage at the top, and on the lower floor was Hurry Up Shoe Repairs. But Carmen actually remembers a time before Hurry Up Shoe Repairs. In her book she says, "The lower floor of the building was the well-known club called the Mexicali, or the Powder Puffs. Not only did straights patronise the place, but also a great number of loose-wristed girls who could always be seen mincing in and out of the entrance to the place." Well, the balcony actually occupied what was once called the Roseland Cabaret, and that goes right back to the 1940s, and Carmen actually remembers having drag balls in the 1940s at the Roseland Cabaret, a beautiful dance venue, and there are a number of images of that dance venue which are available through, I think, the National Library or Alexander Turnbull Library. So Carmen would greet patrons at the ground level and usher them upstairs, and her aim was to, quote, please and tease. Fire dances, Spanish flamenco, comic acts, belly dancing and much more. I had the lot. Male strippers, female strippers, transvestites, sex change girls and drag queens. My place was renowned. She could actually host up to 400 people there, so it was a really, really big venue. So we've got a couple of playbills here from the balcony, and you can see what was on offer. And so we've got Adam and Eve, sexy, kinky couple, and then also we've got another playbill here, if I can just bring it up. And we've got the graveyard ceremony, schoolgirl expelled, Nadine, jungle slave girl, and Carmen topless. Well, Carmen used to hand out her business cards for her other businesses, so things like massage parlours, to people that were coming to the balcony. As she would put it, she wanted to offer them a place to go for a gentle touch. We should note that for the idea about massage parlours and brothels, so in the 60s and 70s, the City Council actually sanctioned massage parlours, so you could have a quite legal massage parlour, but in terms of sexual activity, that was illegal. So it was this kind of odd situation where people knew that the massage parlours were offering sex services, but that was illegal, but the massage parlour wasn't. And so that it's quite an interesting shift from then to now.
Well, back to the balcony, and the club had a bar but no liquor licence. What it did have was a button that was pushed at the doorway, which could alert the people in the bar upstairs if the police were coming and give them enough time to hide the alcohol before they were raided. Carmen also had a radio that could tune into public communications, police communications, and so she knew where the police were and very often what it was that they were looking for. She also knew a lot about a lot of people, and this may very much have helped her relationship with the police, if you know what I mean. At her 70th birthday, a couple of former police presented her with the pink policeman's helmet as a token of their affection and appreciation. And here's a great image of that, which is now in Te Papa. There was, however, a darker side to all this, and her book tells about the risk of wearing female clothing in public in New Zealand and Australia. She says that the police were corrupt. She says they had to put on an appearance of keeping law and order, and we poor drag queens were an easy catch for good publicity at a time when most gays still lived in the closet. Well, numerous times the police tried to entrap her for sex work, and her first major run-in with the police was in 1962 in New Zealand, when she was found guilty of running a brothel in Wellington. She was originally charged to 3 months in prison, and when she appealed that sentence, unfortunately the judge extended it to 6 months in Mount Crawford prison on the Miramar Peninsula. Now, Carmen sort of puts on a pretty brave face about the whole thing, and she says in her book that the prisoners were often held together in the exercise yard known as the arena. And she remembers that around and around they went. They were like sex-starved lions. I never used the arena toilets. It wasn't safe for a lady to go in there. 200 lustres would have been a few many to cope with. And as I say, well, she puts a bright face on things. It would have been horrendous, I imagine, for Carmen in Mount Crawford prison.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to our next stop now, and this is just on the other side of the town hall. This is actually not a venue that was Carmen's, but it does have a Carmen relationship, and we're looking at a entranceway to the Sun Sauna Bathhouse. So the Sun Sauna was one of Wellington's first male sex-on-site venues, and it was very much on the down low in the 60s and 70s, but offered a place for men to go to kind of find each other. The interesting thing with this venue is that on the ground floor we had a cafe, and the cafe was run by Youth for Christ. And then we've got the door to go to the Sun Sauna. But if you go in that door and you went up the stairs, the first business you would come to would be the Scripture Union bookshop, and then you would go down to the Sun Sauna. And I've always thought it's strange, well, interesting bedfellows, having both not only Youth for Christ on the ground floor, but also the Scripture Union on the top floor as well. The reason why we're talking about the Sun Sauna is, and in fact it's actually behind us. We're just behind Roger. There's an entranceway still. The actual building has been demolished, but that's still where the entrance would have been. The reason we're talking about the Sun Sauna is that Carmen never had a explicitly gay business. she was very much catering to kind of mainstream crowds. And in her book, she talks about she had always wanted to have kind of like a gay themed business, but that never happened. And so she would send her gay clientele down to the Sun Sauna here on Wakefield Street. So that's quite a nice little story. Just to give you a bit of a glimpse into how the Sun Sauna advertised itself. This is from the 1970s. We was and we still is the friendliest sauna in town. We're moving on to our next stop now, and actually our next stop has another advert which we'll just show you here. This is Carmen's new International Coffee Lounge. And so the original International Coffee Lounge, which we'll come to very shortly, is in Vivian Street. This version of the Coffee Lounge was opened in the late 1970s, and I'll just put you into, you can actually see it behind us. If I move, it's the red door behind me, and the Coffee Lounge itself was on the first floor. And there's just a map of where we actually are. This is Lower Cuba Street, and the second location of the International Coffee Lounge is at 43 Cuba Street.
Another business that is related to Carmen, but not one of Carmen's, in this area is in fact the Michael Fowler Centre. Now the Michael Fowler Centre was named after Sir Michael Fowler, who was the Mayor of Wellington when the building was being built. But Carmen actually has her name on a plaque inside the foyer of the Michael Fowler Centre because she contributed to the raising of funds to build the Michael Fowler Centre, and she sponsored 2 floor tiles in the main foyer of the Michael Fowler Centre.
And we'll just see those now. So here we can see this is Carmen's name, obviously. So that's in the foyer of the Michael Fowler Centre. And then I'll just see if I can bring up the other one. And the actual floor tiles themselves are located just in front of one of the staircases going into the top floor, or well, the first floor of the Fowler Centre.
So Carmen and Michael Fowler had quite a history. In 1977, Carmen ran for mayoralty of Wellington at the time when Sir Michael, the late Sir Michael I should say, was mayor. He was a National Party member and socially conservative, and in the early 1980s he was picketed both in Wellington and San Francisco for not allowing lesbian support organisations to advertise on public buses. Now Carmen had the backing of the businessman Bob Jones, and we think this may have been his car, again advertising for Carmen. Among other things, Carmen campaigned on decriminalising sex work, lowering the drinking age to 18, decriminalising abortion, decriminalising homosexual activity, and sex education in schools. So, yeah, as I say, she was many, many years ahead of her time. A newspaper advertisement from her campaign, endorsed by 250 citizens, read, "We believe that Carmen, by her visionary intellect, her achievements in many diverse fields, her obvious capabilities and broad physical appeal, stands out above all the other candidates for this important public office." Well, in fact, Michael Fowler eventually won the race, but who can forget Carmen's campaign message, which was "Get in behind." And with that, let's move to our next stop.
And I think we're already here. That is, this is the Rainbow Precinct, and this was championed by former Mayor Justin Lester. And so we have the wonderful Rainbow Crossing just in between us here. That was repainted in January 2022. And also in this area we have Carmen's pedestrian traffic light, and this is what Carmen looks like immortalised in the green pedestrian traffic light, not only on this crossing but also going up Cuba Street as well. So these were championed by former Mayor Celia Wade Brown, and they were launched in 2016. And at the time, Dana DeMilo, who was a very close friend of Carmen, said at the launch, actually they should be the red traffic light, because Carmen was very much into the red light area of Cuba Street. So all of that happened in 2016, and they're still shining very brightly. And this rainbow crossing was launched in 2018, and it was launched on Carmen's birthday, so the 10th of October. 10th of October 1936 is when Carmen was born, and sadly she passed away in 2011. But Mayor Justin Lester really wanted this rainbow crossing and the rainbow precinct, and he not only wanted it, but he also came and painted some of it as well. The Transport Authority opposed the crossing. They said that it was going to create a dazzling and distracting effect for motorists, and the police also opposed the crossing, but Justin Lester pushed through with it, and I am not aware of any accidents on the crossing itself. Maybe
caused by a dazzling
or distracting effect. So it would be interesting to know if they have been actually, because that would be a headline, wouldn't it?
It would.
Absolute headline. But yes, so this is the Rainbow Precinct, and we're going to be coming back to that very soon in terms of some other exciting stuff coming up. But now we're going to move just a little bit over onto Marion Street, and we're going to be talking about this whole area really. This is a part of a mural that was done in Marion Street in the 1990s to pay tribute to the sex workers of the area. And when I say area, we're talking about, I'm just going to bring up a map and we'll just have a look at where we're actually talking about. Let me do this. So the red light area in Wellington is kind of Gusney Street, Marion Street, and I just need to move this over just slightly, and excuse me while I do this. We're talking kind of Gusney Street, Marion Street, Vivian Street and Cuba Street, so it's that kind of block. And that was really the red light area for decades from the 60s, and in 1967, Carmen worked this area. So she had just come back from Sydney and was beginning to live in Wellington, and she was just about to set up her International Coffee Lounge, which was her first business here. To pay the bills, she needed some extra money, and so this is where the sex work came from. And as Carmen says in her autobiography, I virtually had no cash resources. I would have to rely very much on my personal charm to secure the extended credit for the business. I haunted the footpaths and the alleyways. I took most of my clients into the unlit side alleys of the area for what I called short-time knee tremblers. Carmen had actually started doing sex work back in the 1950s when she was in her early 20s, and she remembers in her book, "I was quite flabbergasted, money for what I loved doing for free. I had a saleable item. I had a saleable commodity, and the selling was all pleasure." So it was around this time that a client asked Carmen what her name was, and she replied Carmen, and that was inspired by Carmen Miranda, and also there was a film called The Loves of Carmen, and that starred Rita Hayworth, and so it was those two things that gave Carmen her name. The police tried to entrap Carmen quite a number of times for the sex work, and a number of times she was taken to court, but there was one entrapment effort that the police really mucked up, and it resulted in a wonderful headline the next day where it, in the newspapers it said, "Touched cop didn't resist."
Well, despite the possibility of fines or even imprisonment, Carmen found the sex industry very lucrative. In 1969, she established an unlicensed massage parlour with happy endings on Moxham Avenue in Hataitai, and it was called the Cottage. Now, before it became a brothel, the building was used as the Moxham Street rest home, so Carmen brought a bit of a change of pace to the building. She rented the large house for $200 a week and made a profit of $500 a week, tax-free. At the same time, she was running the International Coffee Lounge and the Balcony Cabaret. And she had 5 workers working at the brothel, and the rooms were designed to cater to different client fantasies. So there was an Egyptian-styled room, an African jungle room, there was an English and an Asian-styled room, a bondage room, and a school classroom. And there's a great image here of Carmen in one of those rooms with a prop from the brothel. Now, clients were referred by way of business cards, and they were given out to people at the airport, often by friendly taxi drivers, and also from Carmen's other establishments.
Well, the cottage was a bit short-lived, and what happened was that a number of clients actually turned up at a neighbouring property, and unfortunately the neighbouring property had 2 policemen living there. And so the policeman went to the landlord, and the landlord then went to Carmen and said, I want you out of the property. I'll give you 6 months rent if you vacate the lease. And Carmen said, okay. And so she vacated, but unfortunately the landlord reneged on that promise. And so Carmen brought out her very secret weapon, and that was, what was that then?
It was a voodoo doll.
It was a voodoo doll, because Carmen was big into voodoo, and this is one of the dolls that are in Te Papa, and I'm not sure if this is the one that Carmen is talking about in her book, but Carmen says, I put pins into my voodoo doll. That landlord died suffering a slow, shaky sickness. Generally, I'm not one for taking revenge, but if anyone crossed me badly, I haunted that person until I'd finished with him properly. Most were young men employed in government departments. Years later, I found one had died of cancer, one had been hit by a truck, one had a hook instead of a hand, and the other had drowned. So there's a very clear message there, and that is not to mess with Carmen. No.
Good advice.
No. So we're going now from Hataitai back into town, and we are going to the Peacock, and that's on the corner of Vivian Street and Tory Street.
So in the early 1970s, Carmen operated the Peacock here on the ground floor as an overflow for her International Coffee Lounge when it was along Vivian Street, just along the road from here. The entrance was through an alcove on Vivian Street, and you can see that just sort of beneath the sign Tequila Joe there's an entranceway. Now, Carmen described the interior as having peacock feathers scattered everywhere and pictures of peacocks on the walls. The place was like a night with 1,000 eyes, with the addition of Egyptian heads, pictures of pyramids, desert sands, and beaded curtains on the doorways. Once after a water leak, the damaged carpets had to be ripped up, and staff found a trapdoor to the basement. And when Carmen went down to investigate, she discovered what had been cubicles when the place had been used as an opium den many decades before. On the first floor, at one point, the Diamond Football Club had club rooms, and Carmen remembered those tough, rough footballers were up there. Still, one doesn't mind a bit of rough trade now and again, does one? And she later it became a popular meeting place for some parts of the lesbian community, and in 1973 a group of lesbians approached Carmen to see whether they could run the establishment, and it is there that Wellington's first lesbian club began, Club 41.
Well, just a little bit further down Vivian Street, you can see, so the Peacock is the little blue dot on the right, and then we've got Carmen's International Coffee Lounge in the middle. So this is at 86 Vivian Street, and this is the first location of Carmen's International Coffee Lounge. You'll see that, you might just be able to see that next door on the left hand side is the Salvation Army, and that's a very interesting combination. Again, we've got the Salvation Army and Carmen's next door. Carmen referred to this stretch of town between Taranaki and Tory Street as heaven and hell, and she talks about the Salvation Army in her book, saying that they were very good neighbours. This is an image of what the International Coffee Lounge used to look like from the outside. I'll just point out that on the right hand side we've got Carmen's International Coffee Lounge. On the left there's that white kind of display window. That is actually the location of Carmen's first Curio shop. So the coffee lounge came first, and then about a year later the Curio shop started in the building next to it. And then we can't see it in this image, but if we go left one more, we would then come into the Salvation Army. So the building for the coffee lounge was actually a clothing factory, and it had a clothing factory on the ground floor and bedrooms on the top floor. And Carmen walked past it in 1967, and it had just been vacated, and she could see the real potential for multiple kind of income streams going on there. So it officially seated up to 80 people, but Carmen remembers up to about 150 people in there at any one time. It ran from 6 o'clock to 6 o'clock in the morning, so 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. And Carmen recalls that the staff did the cocktail shift, the cockroach shift, the graveyard shift, and the milkman shift. Here's an image of a business card that Carmen used to hand out, and you might note that the times are different from the ones I've just mentioned in terms of the opening hours, but I think the times varied. This business was here for like 10 plus years, so it kind of did vary. The menu was very simple. It had tea, soft drinks, those special alcoholic coffees, and a great variety of toasty sandwiches. And actually, I'm just going to change the background so we'll just point out that where the location of the International Coffee Lounges is actually just behind me in this black building on the far right. And then we've got the Salvation Army on the middle. So that's kind of like where we are in Vivian Street. But yes, the toasty sandwiches. The toasty sandwiches were a thing of wonder. They were 3 bits of bread. So you had bread filling, and so it really was a meal, and they were renowned. The walls of the coffee lounge were red, and they were hung with red plush velvet curtains. There was also a tropical fish tank. There was a jukebox, a piano, a mirror, and displays of wild grasses and peacock feathers. I think we've said a number of times on our tours with Carmen, she really knew how to go from take the world outside, which was quite drab when you think of what Vivian Street would have been quite run down at that time, and turned it into fab. So everywhere, all her businesses had this wonderful kind of exotic, kind of dream-like sense about them. Carmen remembers, I gathered about me young people of all sexual persuasions. There were homosexuals, heterosexuals, lesbians, bisexuals, pedophiles, masochists, sadists, transsexuals, transvestites, cross-dressers, you name it. So a whole variety of people. And what about the clients? Well, Carmen recalls that the band The Hollies was visited. She was very prone to saying that the Prime Minister Norman Kirk had opened the coffee lounge. In fact, he did come in on the first morning of the coffee lounge. At that time, he was the leader of the opposition, and I think they might have been meeting up at somewhere like Trades Hall, but came in on that first morning. But Carmen puts it way better than I could possibly in her book. She says, and they came, the big time nobodies or nothings, con men and cheats, straight and very lonely people, the hung up, the bored, the suicidal, the depressed, Hollywood stars, radio stars, fallen stars, megastars, monsters and mere mortals, actors and actresses, gigolos and hustlers, poofters and freaks, honeysuckers and kinks. What a great line. Again, this comes from Carmen's book. Great read. Yeah.
Well, private entertainment happened upstairs in one of the themed bedrooms, and first clients would come in downstairs into the cafe, and once they were finished, they would position their cup to tell Carmen what kind of a liaison they were after. So a cup upside down on a saucer was for straight sex, a cup on its side was for a transgender liaison, and a saucer on top of a cup was for a gay liaison. Now, as Carmen says, this is how I really wish I had more of a Carmen's voice, because she speaks in a voice that's much deeper than mine. But anyway, this is what Carmen had to say. I would more or less hypnotise all my guests like a black widow spider and trap my clients caught in my web. As people left my coffee lounge at 6 a.m. or earlier, I would splash them with Carmen's exotic juice, which meant that they would be back another night for more. The scent would guide them to me. Some would hear my voice like an eerie whisper from the depths of darkness. It's classically dramatic from Carmen.
We're heading further down Vivian Street, and let's just go to the slide. And what we're actually looking at is a space that's currently empty, but it is going to have 2 memorial seats to Carmen and Chrissy Wituku. And so the launch and the installation of these seats is going to be on Saturday the 1st of October, and you're more than welcome to come along to it. The seats were an initiative, a collaboration between Pride NZ, the City Council and the Chrissy Wituku Memorial Trust. So Chrissy was a close friend of Carmen's and took over one of her coffee lounges in the early 1980s, and that was then turned into the Evergreen Coffee House. And so the Evergreen really did become a central hub for rainbow communities in Wellington for almost 2 decades. So both Chrissy and Carmen are very worthy of having memorial seats. And I'll just bring up an image of what's going to be on.
Yeah, this is the perfect place for the seats to be. So the wording on Chrissy's seat will include whakatoki, turn and face the sun and let the shadows fall behind you. And then the wording on Carmen's seat will include a quote from the artist Ariki Brightwell. It is your ancestors, your tipuna, that give you the strength to survive today.
Great words.
Great words, yeah. Yep.
If you want to come and attend that event, there is now a Facebook event. If you just search Pride NZ on Facebook, you'll come up with the actual event itself. So we'll just skip across the road to, if we're doing this physically, we'd be skipping across the road. Given that we're not, we're just going to point to it.
Yeah.
We're looking at Cleopatra's Coffee Lounge at 144 Vivian Street. And just to kind of give you some bearings, so that the seats themselves are on the corner of Cuba and Vivian, so just a bit left of Cleopatra's Coffee Lounge.
Yes, and you can see the subway behind us. No, you can't actually see the subway behind us. The subway behind us now, yes, and so it's in that kind of area of Vivian Street. And this is the heart of Carmen's Wellington. And while setting up the International Coffee Lounge, she worked the streets and the alleys around here. She performed at Trades Hall, which is just a bit further down Vivian Street. She worked at the Club Exotic, which is on the corner of Cuba and Vivian Streets. It's now Ombra, the restaurant Ombra. She worked across the road at the Purple Onion, and then just to the left of the subway building here. The Purple Onion was Wellington's first drag and striptease club. It was one of the first venues that Carmen performed in Wellington, and there's a great image here of the Purple Onion, one of the drag reviews there from 1965. Now, at the time it was acceptable for drag performers to wear female clothing while performing in a show, but not out in public. Now, newspapers from the 1960s and earlier were peppered with stories about masqueraders, as they were referred to in the papers, being prosecuted by the courts. Now, this went on until Carmen's landmark 1966 court case. On the 9th of January 1966, Carmen was arrested in Auckland for behaving in an offensive manner in a public place. Now, that offensive manner was because she was wearing a black frock, black silk stockings and high-heeled shoes. Now, Carmen wasn't having any of this harassment, and it was police harassment. She turned up to court to defend the charge still in female clothing. Now, the police told her to go home and get changed into male clothing, but she refused. She said, "You caught me dressed as a woman, and so I'm going to go to court as a woman." Well, Justice McCarthy, who heard the case, not only dismissed it, but he said in his decision notes that he was quite unable to find anything in our law which says that it is unlawful for a male to attire himself in female clothing.
I just want to show you this image of Carmen. This is taken by Phil Rogers, and this was actually during Carmen's last visit to Wellington, and Carmen standing on the corner of Vivian and Cuba, and at the time there was a sex shop behind, sex pills that work. That was at a time when they were being sold there. And currently that is Ombra. So that's a really lovely shot from Phil. But also where that subway building is behind us was the Cleopatra's Coffee Lounge, and here's a lovely image of Carmen. We're not sure if this is Cleopatra, but
It looks Egyptian, doesn't it?
It's very Egyptian. Carmen loved Egyptian artifacts, and so there was a lot of this in her businesses. So Carmen had Cleopatra's Coffee Lounge. It was actually right next door, which is quite amusing, I find, to Steve's Fish and Chip shop. So where the arrow is where Carmen's was, and then we had the very, I don't know if I should say drab, but very just ordinary Steve's Fish and Chip shop. This building, of course, was then what Chrissy Wituku took over in the 1980s, and so again, where the arrow is where the Evergreen Coffee House used to be located. This building is no longer here. I think it was went up in flames about 2004, 2005. So we're going to move to our next stop now, and this is a stop we actually don't really know that much about. I'll just bring up the map. We're at Carmen's Bazaar, 236 Cuba Street, and so you can see we've just turned Vivian Street into Cuba Street again, and this is Carmen's Bazaar, and it's the building behind us, the kind of cream building with the red trims. We think, well, this was operating in 1969, and we think that maybe this was an iteration of Carmen's Curio shop. So Carmen, to run a Curio shop, a second-hand shop, Carmen needed a second-hand dealer's license, and the reason for that is because the police think that a lot of stolen goods go through second-hand shops. Well, to avoid that, they license the owners. They actually opposed Carmen getting a second-hand dealer license, but a judge said no. I mean, she's got some legitimate businesses. She should be allowed a license, and she got one. She has a lovely quote in her book. As she put it, "I decided to expand my business interest into another field that I enjoyed, namely junk. Antiques to the customers, of course." And so there's some wonderful images of some of the shop fronts, and we'll see one very shortly, where there is so many wonderful kind of trinkets and knickknacks and antiquities. That may not be real. She was very much into all of this stuff. Right, well, up to our next stop, which we've got an image of here. In the late 1970s, Carmen had 3 businesses here, and it was a time when she was moving away from the Balcony nightclub further in town. Firstly, there was the Havana Hair Beauty Salon, which Carmen ran for about a year in 1977, and it was run by Dion, one of Carmen's top hostesses. With the red arrow here is pointing as the business that was the space. It then became an Egyptian tea room, and again, Carmen showing this real gift for being able to transform spaces and being able to reimagine spaces is something quite extraordinary. So she had 2 large paintings of Cleopatra and Nefertiti hung on the walls. There was a large wooden elephant from Egypt standing in the doorway. There were Persian and Egyptian rugs scattered over the polished wooden floors. Large brass vases held dry plant arrangements, and there were ashtrays made of Eastern pottery. The walls were sprayed with golden sand, which, as Carmen remembers, sparkled, giving visitors the feeling that they were at an oasis or perhaps in the Sahara Desert.
Now this was open from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. and offered mainly morning and afternoon teas, but also there was a fortune-telling service, so you could come in and Carmen's gypsy lady would read your tea leaves for you. The business lasted for about a year before Carmen moved it to Lower Cuba Street, where possibly it merged with her new International Coffee Lounge, which was down there as well by the Michael Fowler Centre.
And nowadays, currently, though that building with the Egyptian tea rooms used to be, is actually under this white plastic. This is Upper Cuba Street, and the tea room actually is where that bit of green netting is, just underneath that. To the left-hand side, currently it's just a bit of a kind of a roadway area. Actually used to be another one of Carmen's businesses, and here's a photo from the 1970s. So this is the Connoisseur Massage Parlour, and colloquially it was known as Carmen's Gazebo, and in 1977 it operated here. She actually built a 2-metre high fence, you can see there, just to give the clients a bit of privacy. Prior to this being a massage parlour, it was St Anne's Kindergarten and Day Nursery. So it's obviously, again, had a lot of interesting history, doesn't it, really? Yeah. Well, our last stop is just a little bit further down Cuba Street, or up Cuba Street, and it's the second location of Carmen's Curio shop.
Yes, this is right at the very top, in fact, just on the corner of Webb and Cuba Streets. Now, at one point, Carmen thought of calling this shop Burnt Offerings because Carmen suspected that many of the items that were being bought and sold there were perhaps hot, as in stolen. She operated there in the 1970s and opened just in the afternoons. And at that time, she was being kept very busy with her other businesses, the International Coffee Lounge and the Balcony in particular. And she wrote of how busy she was on any given night. She said, "I had to keep to a tight schedule of appearances. I spent from 6 p.m. until just before 11 p.m. at Carmen's International Coffee Lounge. Then I took a taxi to the Balcony, where I stayed until about 2 a.m. Then there was another taxi ride back to the Coffee Lounge in Vivian Street." And then in 1972 or thereabouts, the architect Ian Athfield approached Carmen and he offered her a space in the new Plymouth Emporium, which was set up at the top of Plymouth Steps. And so the business, the junk shop, Carmen's Curios, was moved there for a time.
Well, just reflecting back now on Carmen's time in Wellington, so we're talking only 13 years, and within that period she had at least 12 businesses here, which is quite remarkable. And when you think she actually started with nothing when she came to Wellington, so a very remarkable entrepreneur. She left Wellington in 1980 and lived permanently in Australia, but she did come back on numerous occasions. One of them was in 1988 when she came back to launch her book here in Wellington. But then also in 2006 she came back to the boat shed for her 70th birthday, and we're back now behind us with the boat shed location on the harbour, which was an amazing experience. And in 2010 she received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Araha Festival. Carmen's last visit was back to New Zealand in 2010, and she was judging the whole, the Queen of the Whole Universe, which I think is the world's largest drag contest, drag performance, which is it was an amazing event, and so she came back to judge that, and that was in Auckland in 2010, and then sadly she passed away on the 14th of December 2011. But one of the really lovely things is she kept performing right to the very end, and this is an image taken on her 75th birthday, and I have misplaced the photographer's name and I apologise for that, but this is an amazing image of Carmen performing just a couple of months before she passed away in December.
Well, this is the end of our tour, and the final words should really go to Carmen. There was a spectacular farewell ball held for her in Wellington before she travelled to Sydney in February 1980. And she was gifted a beautiful korowai cloak on the occasion, which was placed around her. And she wrote of that occasion, "I said my goodbyes on the floor of the ballroom and took the walk along the foyer to the street. It was as if I was walking from the main stage of a theatre along an apron that led to a void. I realised that I was headed somewhere, but I couldn't even guess where. The spotlight was on me. The packed audience was standing, crying, waving goodbye. I fully knew I was experiencing the end of a great era in my life, a most profound moment."
Well, thank you so much for coming on this virtual walk tour of Carmen's Wellington. We really hope that you got something out of it, and please feel free to get in contact if you've got memories of Carmen. We'd love to hear from you. As I say, we have got that unveiling event on the Saturday the 1st of October 2022. It starts at 3:30 at S&M's 176 Cuba Street. You're more than welcome to come along and help celebrate both Carmen and Chrissy Wituku. It would be amazing. Again, thank you to Wellington Pride for having this as part of the Pride Festival. Really appreciate that, and hope you've had a lovely walk with us. Actually, probably need to go out and have a real physical walk now. Yeah. But yes, have a lovely afternoon, and thanks for watching.
Ka kite.